Hi, and welcome back to this week's Torah review entitled The Art of the Complaint. Now, we all know as Jews how much of a fine art this is. In Yiddish, there's a great word for the ugly side of complaints. It's called kvetching, which is sort of like whining. And it's very important to know the difference between a complaint and a kvetch. You know why? Because a complaint is legit, and the kvetch isn't. Now, why is this timely? Glad you asked. Because this week's Torah portion of Behaalotecha starts a series of 3 weeks of Torah portions that are full of kvetching, and everybody is in on it. The people, Moshe himself, Moses, his siblings, Miriam and Aaron. Then later we have the spies, and then we have the rebellion of Korach. It seems like this week's Torah portion is a turning point. It's like everything seems to implode. This week's Torah portion, chronologically, is a little after a year after the Exodus. They spent a long time encamped at Mount Sinai. This was the first time they were starting to move, ostensibly at this point, onwards to the Holy Land, until things unraveled further in next week with the whole saga of the spies. More about that next week. So here's the thing. It's not the first time that the people complain. Earlier in the Torah portion of Beshalach, shortly after the Exodus, the people complained that there's no water and there's no bread. And guess what? God acquiesces, says, yeah, we need to take care of you, and instructs Moshe to strike the rock. Water is produced, bread in the form of manna. Everything is cool. But starting this week's Torah portion with a whole litany of complaints, God is not that amenable. And there's a lot of rather dire consequences and fallout from these complaints. You know why? Because they're more like kvetches than complaints. Now, you know, God really doesn't like kvetching. God likes happiness, and He likes people to be grateful and gracious. And when we are, He responds in kind. One of the Yoms of this week, one of the Hasidic anecdotes of this week from Monday, it talks about how the third Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, would study with a melody. And there were those around him who could tell what he was studying by the melody that he was singing. In other words, his melody was very expressive. Well, here's an amazing story. It was the night, turned out to be the night of the passing of his saintly grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Zalman of Liadi. Long story, how he passed away while fleeing from Napoleon, who was seeking him out. Anyway, he's lying on his deathbed, and his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, knows it, that these are the last few hours of his grandfather's holy soul in this world. And he starts to pray the evening service in a very sort of sad and melancholy type of melody. And his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, stops him and says, not like that, not like that. God wants to hear joyous prayer so that He can return our joy with blessing and positivity and munificence. And so he asks his grandson to change his tune. The Alter Rebbe didn't want to leave this world with a sad song. He wanted to leave this world with a joyous song, so that there should be a positive flow of energy and blessing to those who remained after him. That's really a sidebar, but a nice one. Chapter 11 in this week's Torah portion starts off with saying, Vayihi ha'am kimis'oinanim, the people were kvetching. The Torah doesn't even say what they were complaining about. See, this is a hallmark of kvetching, and one of the differences between kvetching and complaining. Complaint is legit and specific. Kvetching, whining, is like, it's just, it could be anything, and it's really nothing. And that's what the Torah is saying. The people were just being kvetch, which means they were not being appreciative. Then, the Torah says, the Asafsuf, who were the Egyptian converts, known as a mob, they started complaining about the food. They didn't like the desert cuisine. And they started to wax poetic and reminisce about the food in Egypt that they had, the cucumbers and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. A little iffy on the breath there. And the watermelons and the fish and all of that, and the meat, and all of that was for free. And here in the desert, all we eat is the heavenly man. Now, the heavenly man, tasted like whatever you wanted it to taste like. In the mood of sushi for lunch, tasted like sushi. In the mood of steak for dinner, tasted like steak. In the mood of an acai bowl for breakfast with a latte on the side, no problemos. But they complained, because the presentation, because it looked the same, even though it could taste like whatever you wanted it to taste like. We all know a big part of the culinary experience is not just the taste of the food, it's the presentation of the food. Well, here, God is not so favorable, and what he does in his response, and what he does right away, is point out how amazing the man is. And he says the man is a delicacy. Looks like crystal. It could taste like whatever you want it to taste like, and no effort is required on your part to prepare it. Every morning, delivered fresh to your door. God was greatly unimpressed by this kvetching, because it was coming from a place of being ungrateful and unappreciative for what they were receiving. And when Moses hears about this complaint, he says to God, take me out of here, take me out of this world, because he cannot relate to this whatsoever. He can't relate to this because he himself is an incredibly evolved and spiritual person, and to him, complaining about food was so distasteful and so unrelatable to him that he felt like he could not lead the people anymore, because we're just like in two different worlds. We're not talking to each other when he's in a different stratosphere. So this is how things are starting to unravel in the Torah portion here. Now here's the thing. They refer to the food in Egypt as being free. Free? They didn't even have free straw in Egypt. When they had to build cities for Pharaoh, first they were given the raw materials. Then the Torah says they weren't even given bricks. They had to make the mortar themselves. And now they're saying they got free food, free steaks, free fish, free fruits and vegetables. What on earth are they saying? Talk about revisionist history. We'll circle back to that one. A teacher once decided to do an experiment, and he goes to the front of the classroom where there's a big whiteboard, takes out a black marker, and draws a dot on the board. He asks the first student, well, what do you see? A black dot. He asks the next student, what do you see? Same thing, I see a black dot. Every student, same response. And he says to them, how is it that I draw one tiny little black dot on the whiteboard and that's all that you see? How come not one of you said you see a white board? Every one of you is fixated on this tiny black dot. So you see, this is a choice of perspective in life. Life is rarely perfect. There's always deficiencies. There's always a black hole. There's always something missing. There's always a black dot on the whiteboard. The question is, where are we looking? And what are we seeing? And are we appreciating the gifts that God is giving us? Or are we fixated on kvetching about what we don't have or what we think we should have? Very, very powerful thought. A lot of times we are actually the masters of our own fate. And if we are fixated on what we don't have, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a vicious cycle. So listen to this incredible letter that the Rebbe wrote in response to someone who was kvetching about their life. Free translation, I'm just translating the Hebrew here. In response to your letter, in which you write about your life circumstance and that you've never seen anything good in your life, it appears that you don't appreciate the irony or the oxymoron of your very letter itself. Here's a person who the master of the world enabled and orchestrated to meet his wife, his spouse, and bless them with children, and you're saying that you've never seen anything good and positive in your life? That is to be a denier of God's grace in the worst possible way. There are hundreds of thousands of people who pray every single day to have children. And you, who have received this blessing, and it appears without having prayed excessively, don't recognize the richness, the wealth, the happiness that you should have from having children. And so I would like to note here, says the Rebbe, clearly it appears that this person was also complaining about their health, that it's possible that the reason that you have health issues and the reason that you also have a lacking in your financial situation is precisely because of your lack of recognition of the blessings of God in your life in matters that are of even greater import than even health and finances. And that is the blessing of children, of sons and daughters who walk in the path of God. And when you will start to serve God joyfully and with appreciation, you will surely see increased blessing from God, even in the areas of health and finances. Wow. You see what the Rebbe is saying? It's like it's cyclical. The reason that you're not seeing the blessings in other areas of life is because you're not appreciating the blessings that you do have. Wow. That's a kvetch. And kvetching is, as we've been saying, a symptom of lack of appreciation and fixation on the deficiency rather than appreciating what is. And the more we appreciate what is, the more we create a flow for more blessing to materialize in our lives. So earlier on in the Torah, when the people complained about not having food and drink, it was legit. That was a legitimate complaint, and so God provided for them. Here they're kvetching about the presentation of the food. That's already kvetching. For that, Moshe can't relate to it, and God is not about to give in to that or acquiesce to that either. One final point, and that's the answer to the question we asked before. How could they possibly contend that the food they got in Egypt was free? It wasn't free. Nothing was free. Like we said, not even the straw was free. The commentaries say, you know what they meant by free? The Hebrew word chofshi min ha-mitzvot, free of the obligations to do mitzvahs. You see, what they were really complaining about was that in Egypt, prior to the Torah having been given, they were pretty much free to behave in accordance with their own desires and wills and indulge in them. Now they've been given the Torah, 613 commandments, with all sorts of parameters and structures as to moral behavior and ethical behavior. That is what they were really complaining about. So here the Rebbe points out something very powerful. In Hebrew, there are two words for freedom. One is the word chofshi. English translates as free, and chorin or cherut, which also translates as free. But in Hebrew, the words mean two different things. Chofshi, which is what they were saying, but that we were chofshi min ha-mitzvot, free of mitzvahs. That's a kind of freedom that's like loose, like free for all. It's free from, free of obligation. We didn't have the obligation to do mitzvahs. The Talmud says, the freest person is the one who is connected to Torah. What does that mean? Being connected to Torah ostensibly severely inhibits and curtails freedom. You have 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. How could that be freeing? How could that be liberating? So the Rebbe explains, the word chorin means free to, not free from. Free to what? The Torah provides us with the structure to be able to be free to express the deepest, truest, most real part of ourselves. And that is the soul that seeks purpose. That is the soul that understands that I am a creation of God. And my purpose in this world is to serve God, because He put me here for that purpose. So free doesn't mean, or freedom, the ostensibly superficial meaning of freedom is free to do whatever I want, as in without a care and without any obligation. At the end of the day, that's never satisfying. It leaves us hollow. It leaves us just craving more and more, quote unquote, freedom. But it never quenches the thirst of the soul, because what the soul seeks is not freedom of, but freedom to, which means freedom to live a life of purpose, of meaning. And that comes from a creation aligning itself with its creator. I conclude with a story about a rabbi from Eastern Europe, from Lithuania, from a city called Barnovich. His name was Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman, and he had a very prominent yeshiva there. It's about 90 years ago, and he came to raise money in New York for his yeshiva in Baranovich, and he wasn't doing very well. People in New York didn't really feel like this was a compelling cause to support a yeshiva in Eastern Europe. They were busy acculturating into America. That was the old country. So he was getting ready to go back empty-handed and disappointed. And somebody said to him, there's one Jew who has a coat factory in the Bronx. His name is Philip Goldstein. And if you can reach him, if you can touch his soul, that's going to make your trip here worthwhile. He says, Philip Goldstein? It's Feivel Goldstein. I know he's from my hometown. He's from Baranovich. He calls up to ask the secretary for an appointment. She says, Mr. Goldstein's very busy. He can't see anyone. He says, just tell him that it's Elchanan Wasserman from Baranovich would like to see him. The secretary gets back on the phone and says, he'll see you right away. Old childhood friend. He comes to his factory in the Bronx, Mr. Goldstein. He's a American success story. Gives him a big tour of the factory. Shows him all the different departments, how successful he's become. Then he brings the rabbi into his office. He says, no, so tell me, why did you come? He said, I heard that you have a coat factory, and I have a coat that I brought with me, and some of the buttons are loose and falling off. Would you be able to have someone in the factory resew my buttons? He says, of course, with the greatest of pleasure. He takes him to the part of the factory where they sew on buttons, and his buttons are sewn on strong, secure and strong. Rabbi goes back to the hotel. A few hours later, there's a knock on his door. Mr. Goldstein is there. Oh, Mr. Goldstein, come in. They sit down. Mr. Goldstein says, Rabbi, I find it hard to believe that you would have come all the way from Europe just to get your buttons resewn onto your coat. Rabbi Wasserman says to him, indeed, you're right. But listen to me. Your soul traveled into this world a distance far greater than from Baronovich to New York. I don't think that your soul came into this world for the sole purpose of sewing buttons onto coats. Mr. Goldstein got the message that there is a greater purpose in this world, and that is to be an agent to create a more godly world. And of course he gave Rabbi Wasserman a very nice and generous contribution, because he realized that in this Torah study of these students, herein lies the very purpose of creation itself. So friends, the takeaway is that two takeaways. One, it's okay to complain every once in a while, and a complaint could be legit. Kvetching is never good. Takeaway number two is, let us not confuse freedom of with freedom to. The soul's true expression of freedom is free to be its truest self, and that is when we give expression to the soul's desire to be an agent to make the world a more godly place, because herein lies our purpose and our mission. Wishing you good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. Please be sure to check out our YouTube channel at Storm the World, where you also see a brand new song just released in tribute to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, entitled It's Never Too Late, with the great singer Shlomo Simcha. Please check out the video there, share it with your friends. God willing, we'll see you next week.